to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Corey Clark in Philadelphia, and joining us this week are Linda Stein from the Delaware Valley Journal, John Cole from the Pennsylvania Capital Star, and Gillian McGoldrick from the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thanks for joining us. Gillian, I'll start with you as we sit a few days from Governor Shapiro's third budget address. You wrote about him touting that he's been getting stuff done. Talk about what he's been getting done and what the landscape is for him in the legislature with this budget address coming up.
Yeah, so Governor Shapiro now is at his halfway point through his first term. Hasn't officially announced that he's running for re-election yet, but we all expect him to. During his first 2 years and throughout his time as governor, he has said his administration's motto has been getting stuff done. Sometimes he substitutes in a different S word for stuff. And
right, that's the more G-rated version, right?
Yeah, yes. And it's funny to see which audiences he says the expletive in front of. The stuff that he's been getting done, I think that there's some argument, especially amongst Republicans in the legislature, about how much he's gotten done. But generally, the main things that he told me he's most proud of accomplishing in his first 2 years is getting Republicans and Democrats to come together in the split legislature, where there's still going to be a narrow Democratic majority in the state House and a strong Republican Senate. Some of those issues are the property tax and rent rebate increase. That's something that they have been that one lawmaker had been introducing for like 20 years. That finally did get done last year. Another one is the school funding case. Granted, that was because of a court ruling that required that the legislature come together and put together a new school funding system because the current one was unconstitutional. He said he's really proud of being able to bring both parties together, and says that he still has a bunch more ideas of things he wants to accomplish.
Linda, you covered a poll that came out that talked about where the governor stands or how the people see him on certain issues, and school choice was one of them, right?
Yeah, that was something that he actually did not get done, that he had promised to do when he was campaigning. There are these lifeline scholarships for children who are in failing schools. And I think probably under pressure by the Democratic House, he decided to line item veto the school choice. Go ahead, Gillian.
Oh, no, I would just meant after you're done.
Oh, okay. So, that's one thing that he did not get done. Of course, he did do a lot of stuff. I know in this area, it was kind of a big deal that he got I-95 opened again pretty quickly.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on that, and looking ahead to the budget address he'll make next week. The one thing that he on school vouchers, the Senate Republicans still are really hurt by how he did not fulfill his promise there, and that's something that Leader Pittman said. That is something that President Pro Tem Ward said to me, that they are still wanting him to fulfill that promise, and there will be some reservation on their part on making compromises where they otherwise wouldn't have. But for the budget address next week, he's going to be facing a $4.5 billion budget shortfall starting this year, and that budget shortfall is expected to continue to grow in the coming years. And that is because Pennsylvania is set to it's going to be spending more than it brings in for the next few years. It started to last year, but they tapped into some of its savings, its surplus, its rainy day fund. They tapped into some of these extra monies that they have had been accumulating since the pandemic. So we'll see. He'll have to, and he said he plans to reintroduce and repropose some new revenue generators to help make up that gap. But I think that he'll have to also pitch that they tap into their savings again.
Well,
I'm sorry, you go first, Linda.
I was going to say, back regarding school choice, there may be a federal impetus now for the states to get on board with that, with something that Trump just signed an executive order on it. So we'll have to see how that plays out in Pennsylvania.
And I wanted to add it as well with, again, Governor Shapiro's budget address being next week, something that I'm keeping an eye on as well, in addition to education, which I know has been a main focus, not only in the Shapiro administration. We know under the previous governor, Tom Wolf, education funding was front and center during a lot of these budget negotiations. I'm also keeping an eye on mass transit, because even though this is an issue that maybe those in the Southeast and the Philadelphia area have seen more about, however, in regards to SEPTA funding, SEPTA has experienced a budget shortfall. A few months ago, Governor Shapiro announced that he flexed federal funds from the highway funds into putting money into SEPTA that at least allows SEPTA to not have to cut, not have to drastically increase rates as well as cut services. That, however, that fix, as Governor Shapiro said in Northeast Philadelphia in December, that is not a long-term fix, that federal flex funding. So the interesting thing I'm looking at for this budget as well is what sort of mass transit funding is going to be proposed, and will there be some sort of compromise? Because again, I think around July is when SEPTA will need, again, some sort of solution on this. If not, they will have to drastically raise rates, and that could also, by the way, impact other mass transit systems across the state. I know SEPTA is the one that gets the most attention, but that's something I'm also keeping an eye on. And to Gillian's point about where can they, for a budget shortfall, where can they get these other streams of revenue? I know something the governor's talked about for a couple of years. We don't know if this will get across the finish line, but we know marijuana has been something that has been discussed as something that potentially could be legalized, and they could use tax revenue for that. There are a bevy of bills right now in the legislature, I know, that are floating around there, some with different intents, I guess some with selling in state stores, some private. I don't have all the details off the top of my head right there. But I know Governor Shapiro was recently asked about it, and he's reaffirmed, as he said for a couple of years, that he supports the legalization of recreational use of marijuana in Pennsylvania, citing that there's, many of Pennsylvania's neighbors have already legalized it: New Jersey, New York, Maryland. And I think that him and other supporters believe that the state is losing out on tax revenue to some of the neighboring states.
I think they are.
Yeah. And the question, I suppose, remains, one, again, I think this is something that we'll see talked about in the next few months, but the question is, what kind of bill can get people on both sides of the aisle? Because as Gillian mentioned, and Linda, you talked about as well, Democrats right now, I believe it's 101 to 101. Currently, there's one vacancy due out in Allegheny County, but that seat's expected to stay in the Democratic Party's hands. Democrats will have likely a one-seat majority moving forward, and the Republicans have a multiple-seat majority in the Senate. So there needs to be some sort of compromise on that. So I'm really fascinated to see, will marijuana legislation be in this picture as well in the next few months, and how that could potentially play out during budget negotiations.
What's the holdup? What are the prevailing attitudes when it comes to that, say from the GOP side?
Well, I think some people have concerns about the effects of marijuana, things like on DUIs. It stays in your system longer than alcohol, for one thing. And then there's other concerns about it being the old gateway drug that leads to addiction of harder drugs. So there's that. So there's those sort of concerns, and maybe the state is going to be losing money for rehab of more people if they're starting out with marijuana and then going on. So,
And one thing I want to add on that, to Linda's point, where most Republicans, I think at this point in time, have expressed those concerns and are not in favor of recreational use of marijuana being legalized in Pennsylvania. However, there are a few Republicans that have been on the record supporting some sort of legalization bill. One of them is State Senator Dan Laughlin out in Erie County in the northwest corner of the state. And I think it's noteworthy that this session, he is now the chair of the Senate Law and Justice Committee, I believe is the name of it. And he wasn't the previous session. So now that you have a Republican who is in favor of marijuana legalization chairing a committee that might deal with some of those issues, something I'm keeping an eye on as well as this moves forward.
Gillian, the governor's also talked about using these skill games as a revenue generator as well. Can you just talk about what those are? Because I think people see those in gas stations and places like that, but it's sort of a gray area of the law, right?
Yeah, so skill games have been popping up over the last few years, and they've really proliferated around the state. You get, like you said, you find them in gas stations, you find them in convenience stores, you find them in corner stores, you find them in bars and restaurants, VFWs, and they are slot machine lookalikes that have a skill component. That's their argument for why they are not an actual slot machine and are not taxed. They're currently not regulated and not taxed. You're supposed to pay taxes on winnings, but generally they're not taxed. Like every time you put $1 into a slot machine at the casino, I believe it's a 52% tax. So the state gets a significant portion of all of the funds that it makes. But in these machines that look very similar, or the main one that they really are popping up in is smoke shops, where they sell a bunch of like different like smoking paraphernalia, and then plus you can also, for lack of a better word, gamble. Though the argument is that it is not actually gambling, and that's why it has been able to exist in this legal gray area. The courts have said to some degree that they have a skill component, and that is why they are different than a casino style game. But they still lack regulation. So like the state police and gaming control board, like none of those organizations have any like test to make sure that they're fair, like all those things. So all that's to say, the governor expects it to be a couple $100 million of potential tax revenue just from regulating those machines that are already all over the place. Because at this point, there are still some Philadelphia Democrats that would like to see them banned. Philadelphia City Council actually did pass a law to ban them, but they already are all over the place, and so it makes sense that this is something that they'll talk about as a potential revenue generator in this budget address. Governor Shapiro did say he plans to reintroduce it as one of his potential revenue generators.
and I think there might be some Republican agreement on that, because I know Senator Yaw has a bill to tax those.
And Linda, while we're talking about the legislature, it being a 101 split, there is going to be a special election to fill a vacancy, right? And you had wrote about the possibility of that flipping. It was a Democratic seat held by Representative Gergely, who tragically passed away, but you explored the idea of the Republicans maybe taking that seat.
Yeah, I kind of think it may be a remote possibility given Allegheny County's makeup in, I think it was like something like 150,000 more Democrats than Republicans, if I remember right. But, Republicans are hopeful given how popular Senator President Trump is in the state, that maybe they'll have a chance of taking that seat. But I guess we'll have to see. The election is the 25th, and I understand over the weekend, the Democrats at least are going to choose who they're going to run in that election. So, it should be interesting anyway.
And something I would like to add on, if I may, we know the past 2 years, Democrats had a 1-seat majority. So every time there was a vacancy, these special elections got increased in tension, and for obvious reasons, because should one party flip one of those special elections, the balance of power then changes in that chamber. So it's going to be fascinating to see. This is the first special election in the state house this session, but it likely will not be the last. I mean, we've already seen multiple members of the Pennsylvania General Assembly, particularly in the state house, announce candidacies for other offices, whether it's a county commissionership in certain parts of the state or for judge in certain areas. Now, again, those races, should those state reps win those seats, they wouldn't have to resign until 2026. But there's a chance that, like last session, there may be several special elections that will get increased attention, even though there are, 203 members of the state house, I believe. One district can get a lot of attention for that short period of time, again, due to the divided nature of the state house. And one other thing, just to add on to that as well, there's actually a special election as well coming up for the state Senate. The balance of power, again, is not up for grabs there because Republicans have a multiple seat majority. I know it was discussed on the previous journalist roundtable, but Republicans are hoping to keep the same seat they've had for a while. State Senator Ryan Aument left his seat to take a job with U.S. Senator Dave McCormick. So that seat in Lancaster County is there's going to be a special election for that. I think Lancaster County Commissioner Parsons is a Republican candidate for that, and a local mayor out in Lancaster County is a Democratic candidate. So I know Democrats, of course, are going to make a push for that as well, but I know there's a registration edge Republicans have there, just like the Democrats have the voter registration edge in that seat out in Allegheny County.
Yes.
Yeah, to add on this, the special elections are particularly targeted because they are pretty ripe for flipping a seat because they're so low turnout. So it's really who's going to show up or who's going to cast their mail ballot. I will add, though, that I'm not totally certain that it is really ripe for flipping this seat specifically, only because it is Representative Gergely had won the seat in a special election 2 years ago for Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis's seat out there. So it is. I think that if they need to, they'll bring in the big guns and they'll bring out Lieutenant Governor Austin Davis back out there to make sure the Democrats keep it. But like John said, and Linda, we're gonna see this over and over again, and Democrats will invest heavily to try and flip a Republican vacancy, and Republicans will invest heavily to try and flip a Democratic vacancy.
Linda, you talked about how the Republicans have some momentum. You also wrote about the head of the state party stepping down and there being a vacancy. Who's up for that seat?
Well, we have one of the state senators, Greg Rothman. He's from the Harrisburg area, from Cumberland County. And for lack of a better term, although he says he's an activist and he has some conservative credentials, he seems to be kind of the establishment candidate, because before this he was a state rep and he was a county commissioner, or rather, I'm sorry, a county party chair. So anyway, Greg Rothman is the one guy, but he's being challenged by Bill Bockenberg, who is from Lehigh County. He's a businessman. He's a strong Trump supporter. He's a Trump fundraiser, and he had been a Trump elector in 2020 and 2024. So he said when I interviewed him that a lot of people on the grassroots were calling him and asking him to get involved. So he decided to throw his hat in the ring and challenge Rothman. So that election is coming up February 8th. In a meeting in Gettysburg. There's 300 something state committee people and county chairs that are going to be voting on that.
If I may add, I think it's going to be a really interesting race, and Linda, to your reporting on it, I think it's going to be really fascinating because whoever becomes the party chair certainly has a good amount of influence on how the operation of the party goes throughout the state. I was actually in the room in 2019 reporting on Lawrence Tabus, who was the outgoing chair of the Pennsylvania Republican Party when he was elected. The circumstances were different then. He ended up winning that race. And think of how much the conversation, I think, has shifted in the Republican Party. The feelings have shifted from one election to the next, where after 2022, a lot of Republicans were angry about how that election went, considering Democrats ended up winning the governor's race, with Shapiro winning by double digits over State Senator Doug Mastriano and U.S. Senator John Fetterman winning the Senate seat over Dr. Mehmet Oz by multiple points as well. But then 2024 comes and Republicans end up winning the Attorney General's race, the Treasurer's race, the Auditor General's race, the Senate race. They flipped. Dave McCormick defeated Bob Casey, and then President Trump defeated Vice President Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania. I think it's going to be fascinating to see, again, should those grassroots people have enough support for Bockenberg that could get him over the finish line, or Rothman, who has a bevy of endorsements among establishment and basically a lot of the elected officials are backing Rothman's bid. And I think the interesting thing to follow after that is, what will their philosophy be in terms of leading? Because I know at least in 2022, when Tabus was chair, the state party didn't endorse in the governor's race. And I think that opened an avenue for Mastriano to ultimately win the primary. In 2024, the party took a much different approach, and they wanted to endorse in these races to have a little more influence. So I wonder if 2022, the losses Republicans suffered in 2022, I kind of wonder if that changed their thoughts of whether to endorse or not to endorse. And maybe that's something that will be discussed by both sides.
Yes, I definitely think so. I think that they waited until the very end of that race to endorse Lou Barletta, but it was too late. It was like something like 5 days before the election.
And at that point, President Trump had endorsed Mastriano, I think, as well, like the last minute as well. So at that point, we know President Trump having, of course, a lot of sway in the Republican Party. We'll see if he decides to get involved with this party, this state party chair race. He's not at this point, but you never know. That's something that could happen. And should he, that would certainly change the conversation, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Well, speaking of President Trump, Gillian, you wrote about the this memo, this freeze on grants and loans from the federal government that sort of sent everyone trying to figure out how to get things funded. And then he changed his stance. Can you talk about where that stands, where the federal freeze stands right now?
Yeah, that was quite the 24 hours of panic, especially in state and local governments that receive a lot of federal funding. But yeah, so this memo was leaked earlier this week to the Washington Post, and said that all federal funding, federal disbursements should be put on pause, just to make sure that they are following all of President Trump's recent executive orders, particularly the ones related to DEI, energy, environment, and transgender rights, making sure that they follow these executive orders and there's no federal funds going towards them. And it obviously panicked like nonprofits and state government and local governments that rely on a lot of federal funds. Like in Pennsylvania, it's like about 40% of the state budget or state spending every year is from the federal government. So like, while we're about to all report next week the number that Governor Shapiro pitches to spend in Pennsylvania, it'll be more than $49 billion, I'm sure. It's like more than double that if you include all of the federal spending the state actually does. A lot of that goes towards like health and human services costs. But yeah, so it was a crazy day of panic. The Medicaid system in Pennsylvania was down. The CareerLink system was down and inaccessible, according to Governor Shapiro. And it was like that back end that like you go into to like get payment or be able to like finick around in the database. So, but by the end of the night, all those systems were back up, and a court a federal judge had ruled, put a temporary pause on the pause. And then by the next day, President Trump's administration rescinded the memo. There's a little bit of back and forth. The press secretary also said that the core principle was still standing, even if they rescinded the memo, that they want to make sure that no federal funds are going towards DEI, energy or environment, transgender issues, like making sure that those funds are not going to those places. But we'll see how it goes. It's for now, it's paused. The panic is done for the moment. I don't think that Governor Shapiro will change his pitch at all next week because of it, just because at this point every day is a different day, and the budget negotiations aren't for a couple of more months. So I think he'll probably just make his normal pitch, expecting he gets a lot of federal funds, and we'll go from there.
So what are
Before we
you
run out of
expecting to
time,
happen then? Do you think that the Trump administration will give a more nuanced approach to this?
Yeah, I truly have no idea. I think that it was a bit of a poorly communicated memo in the first place, because like if it were just, if you like, somebody gave me a really good example. Like if you're a library who gets a bunch of federal funds, and you also separately get a DEI federal grant every year, it is just that federal grant for DEI that you would not get. If it had that been communicated a little bit better, I think that the panic wouldn't have been as crazy. But we'll see. No idea.
John, real quick, we got about a minute left. Senator John Fetterman's been in the news a good bit lately. You guys caught up with him. What was the main takeaway from chatting with him recently?
That's correct. So myself, Gillian, was there, as well as a few other reporters at the Pennsylvania Farm Show earlier this month, in which Senator Fetterman was there. He's a member of the Senate Agriculture Committee, so of course it's important to be at the Pennsylvania Farm Show. Interesting conversation. Again, he talked about a wide variety of things with us for a good 10 minutes. He mentioned that he's supporting multiple of Trump's selections for his cabinet. And at that point in time, he said he was planning on supporting them. At this point, he's voted in favor of several of them thus far, more so than most of his Democratic colleagues. And at this point, as we're talking right now, Senator Dave McCormick, a Republican, has voted in favor of all of Trump's selections. We're going to see how that plays out as some of the more potentially controversial picks come up. And we'll see again, should Fetterman decide to join Republicans, or will he stay with his caucus? It'll be interesting to see the kind of role Fetterman has in this next Trump administration, where he actually even went to Mar-a-Lago and met with President Trump. So he's been a Democrat that has made an outreach with the president, and we'll see what kind of role he has in the next 4 years.
All right, we'll have to end it right there. Thanks to our guests, Linda Stein, John Cole, and Gillian McGoldrick. And thank you for watching. I'm Corey Clark. Good night.